Nick Greiner, thanks for joining us. You've heard Dominic Perrottet's pitch yesterday for either an increase in the GST or broadening the base in order to, I guess, decrease or get rid of taxes like payroll tax and stamp duty. What do you make of it?
Well, look, I think it is admirable that Dominic is leading the push for another go at tax reform. There really hasn't been significant tax reform for a couple of decades. I suspect the situation hasn't changed that much, though, even in the sort of post-COVID or COVID period. It's not a problem of working out what to do. It's more a problem of working out how to do it in a political sense. And I noticed that no sooner had Mr Perrottet finished speaking at the National Press Club, I think Mr Albanese took about 30 seconds to rule out any bipartisan look at GST. I think that's very sad, because it is clear that we need to have the best mix of taxes, because the worse the mix of taxes, the harder it is to grow the economy and get people back into jobs. So I think it remains politically very difficult, but I think the Thodey report and what Dominic Perrottet and to a degree Tim Pallas have been saying, I think is clearly in the national interest. It's just a matter of how do you make the politics work, I suspect.
Well, you conducted your own review of the GST in about 2012 with John Brumby, didn't you? What did you learn out of that?
Well, we decided that the actual distribution between the states over a longer period of time wasn't as bad as it appeared. But I think I can own up to the fact that when Prime Minister Turnbull asked me how to fix the problem in Western Australia, which was clearly a legitimate political problem, they were getting sort of 30 cents in the dollar back of the GST raised in Western Australia, I said to him, I don't think there is a pragmatic, realistic way of solving the distribution problem other than throwing money at it. And I think it's fair to say that's what Malcolm and Matthias Cormann did at the time. And that problem, the distribution between the states, I think has been put to bed by that particular mechanism. The harder question is how do you stop the tax eroding? And it's gone down quite substantially in terms of its coverage, and of course the rate hasn't changed in 2 decades. So we're almost the only Western country, Andrew, which allows its main value-added tax, consumption tax, to be effectively frozen. You can't move it up or down, you can't change what it covers, even though what isn't covered is growing and growing, which means that that's untaxed, and the states therefore are getting less and less real GST. It's a bugger's muddle, if I can use that expression. But the problem ultimately is not the intellectual one. It's how you get both sides of politics to agree on the right range of taxes and the right makeup of taxes, both state and federal, because I think the average punter doesn't care if it's a state tax or a federal tax, and of course the GST is raised by one level of government and spent by another level of government. Punters don't care. I think what is needed is what the Thodey report's tried to do, which is look at all taxes, state and federal, and they've come up with, frankly, pretty much the predictable and I think correct set of recommendations. Without repeating myself, I think the problem is how do you get it done? And my answer to that, to perhaps avoid your question, is that the best chance is if Victoria and New South Wales happen to be Labor and Liberal states. They've both got very similar problems in terms of the budgets. They were doing very well. They're now got a much more difficult budget outlook over the next decade. I think if the 2 major states and the Commonwealth were prepared to get together, not just on GST but also on the land tax stamp duty reform, I think that is a way of doing it. It's not going to happen if it's a contested Liberal versus Labor sort of thing. I frankly don't think it'll happen.
So it sounds like the key's Victoria, really, given Dominic Perrottet's enthusiasm. Do you think ultimately Scott Morrison will go there with this? Or with a majority of 3, which obviously is a lot less than John Howard had in 1998, it's just too politically difficult?
Well, I think it's the latter. I think Scott, as he usually is, has been very open with the Australian people. I mean, Scott was keen as Treasurer in looking at GST reform. I think the reality is that unless both sides of politics agree, neither side of politics is going to initiate it and go there. So, yeah, I don't think GST reform is very likely without a grand bargain, if you like, between the centre-left and the centre-right. And as I say, I don't sense that's about to happen.
Well, what's the cost of not doing it?
Oh, it simply means it's harder for Australia to recover. It's harder for Australia to increase its ongoing, its long-term economic growth, which is clearly the answer to fixing the jobs problem that's been created by COVID. So there is no doubt that the cost of inaction, I think David Thodey and his colleagues say pretty much the same thing. The cost of inaction is very great, but it also, I suppose, kicks the problem downstream. Nobody thinks that having the GST erode and erode, it's down to covering, I think, less than 60% of expenditure on goods and services. Now, having a GST or a value-added tax or a consumption tax that covers only 60% and it doesn't cover fresh food, health, education, the private spending on those, they're the things that are growing. So I think the answer to your question is that you end up with a suboptimal, a less than good tax system, and the effect of that is to make it harder for productivity to rise and harder for the economy to grow. And I think most people might accept that, even in politics. The harder thing is to work out the political path to getting it done. And
would you go for broadening or increasing? What do you think is most important? From what you're saying, sounds like broadening.
Well, that's my personal view. I think that's right. I mean, the notion, and that was the original Howard Costello plan, of course, and they also had to go through a similar political exercise, a version of that from 20 years ago. So, yeah, I do think personally that making the base wider is sensible if you want the GST to be, as it is at the moment, the most significant source of state revenue. Otherwise, what's going to happen is, well, health budgets, Mike Baird said this when he was trying a few years ago, health budgets, health spending goes up, up and up, much faster than inflation, and there won't be revenues going up at the same pace.
What sort of compensation would you, or would you do compensation for lower income earners if you were to do it?
Well, I think you do have to do compensation, and the Thodey report says that as well. I think there are degrees, and look, I wouldn't claim to be an expert these days, Andrew, on the detail, but I think Australia's taken a very particular view. Firstly, it's taken a view that you've got to sort of overcompensate. I think in the short term, that's probably realistic for getting something done. However, maybe you've got to invest. You can't have revenue neutral outcomes in the short term, the long term. I think you've actually got to invest in a sense by paying compensation in the short term in order to get a long-term tax mix which will be best for the economy, which is best for people.
And you talk about a tax mix, Mr. Greiner. So, I mean, this is the part that's difficult to explain to people, I guess. If you increase a tax, how does that help jobs? How does that help the economy? What taxes are you cutting because of that increase in order to boost the economy? How does it boost the economy?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, Andrew, and it depends on the deal, of course, that's done. The last GST was based and persuaded about half the Australian public, I guess, that what you were doing was getting rid of a whole bunch of taxes that are counterproductive. What you use this revenue for is a matter of the deal, but it's obvious that stamp duties are not a good tax. They actually stop people moving. They sort of freeze them in the house they're in because the cost of moving is too great. So stamp duties are clearly a tax you want to reduce, change the structure of in some way. I think insurance taxes, and the Thody report makes the same point. It says taxes on insurance, especially in New South Wales, and that is a particular New South Wales problem. They've got some recommendations there. So what you do by changing the GST is you get some currency which you can use to either reduce other taxes or increase spending, or some combination of the two. Mike Baird wanted to increase health spending because he could see the health budget under huge pressure. I think economists are more inclined to reduce or get rid of bad taxes, of which stamp duties, insurance taxes are two examples.
And the PM's spoken about IR reforms. What are the most pressing reforms that need to be done in IR, remembering, of course, that work choices seemed just too big a change for the Australian public?
Andrew, I think you might be taking me outside of where the Liberal Party president ought to go. I think, but it's a good try. Look, I must say, I think the most useful thing that's happened, well, one of the most useful is the Christian Porter ACTU relationship, which does give a sense of the public interest rather than sectional interest. But I might avoid giving you my personal view on industrial relations reform, but it's clearly not going to be work choices revisited. But there are lots of things, and I think the two sides, pretty much business and Labor, agree on what's not working. Enterprise bargaining's not working well. And there'd be some differences maybe on how easily do you have a chance as an employer to change your employees. But the important thing is that I think that that national interest view by the unions, the Business Council and the government is really one of the best hopes, and hope for short-term reform, which I think tax reform's actually harder to do than some of those IR reforms.
Now you spoke about your role, Liberal Party president, finishing up soon with that. You must be very pleased at the situation the Liberal Party's in terms of, well, you're from New South Wales. They've been in office now since 2011 there, been in office federally since 2013. A lot stronger position for the Liberal Party than, say, when you were Premier, for example. You must think this is kind of the golden era of the Liberal Party. And a second part to that, look, you were a big supporter of Malcolm Turnbull, but you must admit now, I guess, the change to Scott Morrison was the right one electorally.
Well, on the last part, I'd have to say that my opinion is the same as the polls. I think Scott has been absolutely, almost stunningly good, both in terms of policy, but more importantly in terms of leading the country, bringing it together. So it's perfectly obvious that he's done a fantastic job. As far as the party goes, I think the party federally, which is my responsibility for another 4 or 6 weeks, we are much more competitive. In fact, we're probably ahead of the Labor Party in terms of technical campaigning, which wasn't the case some time back. There are ongoing problems for both sides in what sort of funding arrangements does the public think are acceptable and useful, because you do have to fund the major parties somehow. But yeah, I think the Liberal Party, and if it's a golden age, but I think organisationally it is stable. I think there's much more discipline both in parliamentary parties and in the organisation. But parties always have outbreaks of ill discipline. But generally, I think you're right. The Liberal Party is in a very strong position, not just in New South Wales and nationally, but around the rest of Australia, although it's finding it harder to win in some of the states.
And finally, this new role of yours, Consul General in New York, let's just say it's a pretty interesting time to go, isn't it? Are you concerned about some of the troubles over there, the COVID-19 even, that sort of thing?
Well, I do think I'm very fortunate to have been given the opportunity. I've always thought New York in many ways is the centre of the world, whether you're into finance, whether you're into the arts, whether you're into medical research, all sorts of things. New York is pretty much the centre of the world, and I've always liked it. I guess I like the buzz and excitement of that sort of thing. I'm sure COVID will get, they're on the downslope of COVID in New York at the moment. I hope they stay that way before I get there around the turn of the year.
Mr. Greiner, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.